Our discussion today will dwell upon forgiveness, and we shall discuss what forgiveness is. We shall also discuss what are those cancers of the soul. We shall look at what forgiveness is not, and the keys to your happiness. Before we dwell into forgiveness or we jump into forgiveness, let's first understand how our brain reacts. In terms of challenges, our brain has two reactions: fear or flight. Imagine a mob comes to you, and when it gets to you, one, you either fight back, two, or you either run. Because our brain will push you to fight. Fight is the ability to face the obstacle that is coming upon you. Then flight is when you don't have the ability, and then now you have to run. However, there is a third instance that we normally forget that is hardly talked about. That is the ability to forget. If you cannot forgive, if you cannot run, and if you can't fight back, then the only option that you're left with is to forgive. You forgive those that have wronged you or those that have done wrong to you. Everyone has a personal story behind forgiveness, whether you are a child, whether you are an adult. Therefore, forgiveness has become a concept in our culture. It has become a concept in our customs, and furthermore, it has been instituted, operated into the education institute department. Many religions, such as Buddha, have emphasized compassion, avoidance of revenge, and grudges. Christianity has emphasized confession, repentance, as well as healing. All these as a way of forgiveness. So, what is forgiveness? Forgiveness comes from a Greek translation which means let go. You have to bury the hatchet. You let go of the debt, or your openness to meet present freshly. Your present situation, you open up to meet it in a new form. That means it takes the mindset, it takes the positive attitude and the freedom for you to open and for you to let go of that you're holding deep inside you. Nelson Mandela once said, "When a deep injury is done to you, you never heal until you forgive." Therefore, your healing comes from your forgiveness. For that reason, forgiveness is a choice that calls you to take action so that you can liberate or free yourself from the bondage that you're being captive in. When you study the Bible, the classical story of forgiveness is seen and demonstrated in the story of Joseph. It is the first time forgiveness appeared in the Bible. Joseph forgiving his 11 brothers. To catch up with you, for those that do not know or remember the story of Joseph, Joseph was born of 12 children, and he was the 11th child, the only child that was loved and favored by his father. His father, when he was young, gave him a long-sleeved robe. This robe was perceived by the community at that time as a person who's going to be a heir. This developed and motivated his brothers to be jealousy against him. They were jealousy because 1, he was the youngest, 2, he was the most favored son, 3, he was now given a robe by his father, a long-sleeved robe. That means he was not going to do the hard work like the way his brothers who had the short-sleeved are doing. So one day, Joseph gets a dream. He gets a dream that he's going to become a king. His brothers and his sisters and his family members were kneeling before him. When he told this dream to his brothers and his father, they all got astonished. However, remember, his brothers were already jealousy about him, so they had to plot to kill him. They stripped him naked, they denied him food, they put him along the caravans, they decided to sell him to the Egyptian merchants, where Joseph went and worked like a slave in Potiphar's house. However, his favor did not leave him. Joseph rose in service and headed the other slaves in the house. Later, Joseph was accused by Potiphar's wife for seducing her. So Joseph was taken to prison. Even in prison, he rose to power. He interpreted dreams for 2 prisoners who later forgot him as they promised. Here is our Joseph, who was betrayed, who had been sold, humiliated, who had been falsely accused, had been forgotten. He was given an opportunity to stand before King Pharaoh to interpret the dreams of 7 harvests and 7 famines, for which he interpreted clearly, and Joseph was placed in charge of the distribution of the grains. That is like the minister of commerce by that time. So after a time, as the famine became deeper and deeper, now Joseph's brothers had to come to Egypt. They were sent by his father. They had to stand before Joseph, whom they could not even recognize by that time because he had changed and was being like an Egyptian. Joseph realized them, but he had to put them on a series of tests to identify their genuinity, to identify their consciousness, to be convicted if they had repented of their conviction. So he had to ask for his brother Benjamin, whom he also loved so much. Remember, 13 years of loneliness. Joseph cried and wept, just as he had dreamt 13 years ago, asked for his father, because he knew his father knew that Joseph had died. Joseph also knew that his father could have died, because 13 years is a very long time. So they were confused, they were scared, they were in his presence, his brothers, so they could not even respond to the questions that Joseph was asking them. After he had revealed himself to them, Joseph asked them not to be angry, because God had used them to preserve him, to preserve their life. He kissed them, he confronted them, and he wept and reconciled and forgave them. We find that this is where Joseph let go. By forgiving, he moved forward. Forgiveness is not a little thing in the Bible. It is the big thing, incorporated even in our Lord's Prayer. Remember, Joseph was now in charge. He had his brothers on his hands. He had his brothers, and he could do anything and whatever he intended to do, because he had the ability, he had the power, he had even the resources. But irrespective of that, Joseph, irrespective of the resentment, the bitterness, and the anger, Joseph chose to forgive. Joseph chose to reconcile. Joseph chose to get back, to let go, and join back with his brothers, irrespective of the wrong things, irrespective of the evil things they had done to him. Why? Because he knew he had the ability to change the past rather than to stick on the future of which he has no control over. It was so easy for Joseph to forgive because we forgive to a degree or to an extent at which we love. So because Joseph loved his brothers so much, it was more easier for him to forgive them. So he looked at the mistake they had done as a one-time transitional mistake. So he referred to the goodness he had at the moment. He never stuck to the bad things that they had done, or he never stuck to his past, but he looked at the physical presence, what he was to do, what he had at the moment, and let go of the past. The biggest challenge with you today is that you have or you do not have the one-time loving and trusting relationship with yourself, because the extent at which you love yourself is the extent, it's the degree that you'll pass on to loving and forgiving others. And if you cannot pass or exchange or forgive and love others to the degree at which you love yourself, you find that there are those cancers that are growing within your soul or within your mind. They start small, but they eat you up. Just as a weed in a garden, it starts small by small. By the end of the day or by the end of the season, it has chained, it has held the whole garden and eaten up all the proceeds. Same applies to your life. Same applies to bitterness, anger, jealousy, and greed. All these hold you in your mind, start small, by the end of the day, they supersede and take over your life, which chain you, which hold you and hinder you from your progress. So whenever you're not progressing, stand still and ask yourself, what is that I'm holding deep inside myself? You may find you have not forgiven. You may find it's bitterness that you failed to let go. Mahatma Gandhi once said that your future solely depends on what you do in the present situation. So it is the present that determines how your future will become. And this takes your mind change. It takes your attitude so that you can be able to foresee and clearly, vividly elaborate or speculate how your future holds. I have seen so many people mistaking forgiveness to so many things. However, let us see what forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not forgetting, but you reaffirm the negative event. In that you cannot forget the event, but you keep reaffirming it. For example, you cannot forget the seasons of the cold, and neither will you shiver. That's why you see people telling their stories and they crying, or they reflect back the effect, or you see them changing. Why? Because the events, they are reaffirming the negative events that happened. Forgiveness does not mean you're not hurt. You are hurt. Forgiveness does not mean that the pain is gone. No, the pain keeps there. Forgiveness does not take away responsibility, but you're still accountable for that wrong act that you've done. Forgiveness never brings it up again. It doesn't mean that once you've forgiven somebody, you never bring it up again. Mandela once moved with his friends and his clergymen and his leaders to a certain hotel to eat, and his bodyguards. As they got to that hotel, they ordered for their meal. However, there is a person, old man, who was seated at the back of the hotel. So Mandela instructed his bodyguards to go and tell that man who was seated at the back to come and join him on the table. This old man came, he had ordered for his food, they brought it, all started eating. However, this man could not eat. He was trembling, he was shaking, he lost his appetite, he was frustrated. Mandela and his bodyguards and his contracts, they all ate and finished and left. When they were moving, the bodyguards and the people asked him why that man was not eating. They said, that man is very sick to an extent that he cannot even eat. Why did you even call him to our table? Mandela told them that when he was in prison, after being tortured, after being mistreated, whenever he went back to his cell, he screamed and shouted, requesting for somebody to bring him water. However, that man that he had called, that man that had sat there, was the one who would come. Instead of giving him water, he would urinate in his cup, Nelson Mandela to drink. Now, Nelson Mandela had let go. Nelson Mandela had forgiven him. But it didn't mean that he couldn't bring it up again. That's why he had to call him to join him on his table and tell his friends later. He brought it up, but he had forgiven. So the man had the guilt conscience to an extent that he had never forgiven himself for what he had done to Nelson Mandela. So that's why he was trembling. That's why he was scared. That's why he could not eat. So that bitterness, that anger, that jealousy, that regret within him was blocking his challenge, was blocking his ability. Yet Mandela had let go. Forgiveness should be distinguished from condoning. Condoning is when you overlook, or you minimize, or you deliberately ignore, or you turn a blind eye onto something. That doesn't mean that you have not forgiven. Forgiveness should also be distinguished from excusing. Excusing is to pretend that the offense never occurred, or the person did not commit the offense, or you minimize any responsibility by the offender. In 2 Samuel chapter 12 verse 9 to 13, God tells us to forgive. God forgave King David, but he shielded him from the consequences of his actions and then recorded them. This happens in our countries where we have our records of our criminal procedures or our criminal acts being recorded by the government. So it doesn't, when they forgive you or when they excuse you, it doesn't mean they also rub those records that have been recorded. However, they keep them, however much they have forgiven you. Then justifying is different from forgiveness, because justifying is mitigating the factors that caused the bad action. Then pardon. Pardon is issued only by the executive arm. However, for pardon to be issued, you need to be guilty. There should be willingness and acknowledgement of the wrong act that you did. Then you should be willing to change and apologize for the wrong act that you've done. Psalms 139 verse 21 to 22 tells us that unpleasant ones become God's enemies. We should not forgive those he hasn't forgiven. Therefore, before God has forgiven people, we shouldn't forgive them. Same applies to us. Before you seek forgiveness from yourself, nobody should forgive you. For that reason, once forgiveness occurs, forgiveness will facilitate reconciliation, because forgiveness is an internal personal process and brings relief to the person who has undergone into that process. And that when you undergo into the process of forgiveness and you forgive, therefore you're able to reconcile. Because reconcile, you will come together, you will restore the trust that somebody had broken or somebody had taken away. Here are some keys on how you can forgive. 1, you have to uncover. Uncovering is being honest. You accept yourself. You accept of the things you've done. Then you need to decide. You decide consciously and unconsciously to take a decision for you to be better. Then you need to work. Work is imagination. How your life was before and how your life is going to be. Then you need to discover. You discover by taking action or becoming an activist in that wrong act that you've done. If there was a wrong act that you've did and you want to make it better, you become more involved in that act so that you can help people get better. When you keep in mind that we have all sinned and we need forgiveness, you will be in control of the past and you'll have the power of the future. 2 twins who were brought up by one father who was an alcoholic. One chose to become a successful businessman. The other became a successful drunkard. So when the society went to question these two brothers who had been grown by or brought up by one family, by one man, but had to choose to take different directions. When they asked the drunkard why he was drunkard, he said because his father was a drunkard. When they asked the successful businessman why he was successful, he said because his father was a drunkard. So the two were separated from the choices they made. We too have a choice to forgive. And once you forgive, that's when you realize the keys to your happiness. One, you'll appreciate what you already have. Do not look for what you do not have. Hold on to that you have and work better to it. Remember, a bird in hand is worth 1,000 in the bush. Two, you need to unending personal growth. This is where you keep learning, because life is a process. Life is a journey. So we need to learn day in and day out so as to be happy and achieve our happiness. There is need for the ability to respond to effectively to advanced situations. How you respond to advanced situations is the way you tackle them. It's the way you hold them. Therefore, if you have a positive attitude towards any negative thing that comes to you, then you'll have the ability for you to forgive easily and for you to open the space for happiness. However, the problem is that we are all stuck in one place. There's a story of an old man who was seated on his couch, and there was a dog beside him that was barking, that was yelling. And this old man who was seated next to the couch was not bothered by the dog. So a passersby looked at the dog barking, screaming, whereas the owner was just seated on his couch reading a book, not minding, came by and asked him, "Why is your dog so barking so much? And you're there seated, ignoring, and you can't help it. What is wrong with it?" The old man said, "That dog is seated on a nail. It's not hurting that much for it to get up." Many of us are just like that dog. We are seated on so many grievances. We are seated on bitterness. We are seated on anger. But because we are not hurting so much, we have failed to learn how to forgive. If you hurt so much, if you've bitter so much, and you want to let go, and you want to open up your space, you want to re-empty your cup, get up of that nail. Forgive and let go. For when you forgive and let go, it's when that you open up the pores, you open up the vast cup of happiness and success in your life.